The first lady of the land during the Civil War was Mary Todd Lincoln. One of her closest friends was an African-American woman, Elizabeth Keckley. Elizabeth knew Jefferson Davis's family down in Richmond, Virginia as well, but she chose to live in Washington. She was the seamstress for Mary Todd, and when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, the woman that gave her great consolation became her confidant and sat with her and grieved in sorrow with her was Elizabeth Keckley. Here in Michigan, Annie Etheridge, who served with the 3rd Michigan Infantry, she was awarded the Kearney Cross for Valor in 1862. Elmina Brainerd, a very famous Michigan gal who worked with the Michigan Sanitary Commission. Again, that evolves into the Red Cross. And an unsung heroine of the state of Michigan. You just never hear about Valeria Campbell. But Valeria Campbell was the secretary for the Michigan Sanitary Commission. She was responsible for sending vast quantities of clothing and food, literary materials, whatever the soldiers needed in the fields. It all passed through Valeria Campbell. And yet, you never hear about Valeria Campbell. You don't hear about Elmina Brainerd. And once in a while, you'll read a little bit about Annie Etheridge. The South as well had some great ladies that supported their cause. Belle Boyd and Rosie O'Neill Greenhow both worked as primarily as spies. Phoebe Yates Pember was a young Jewish woman who early in the war lost her husband. She dedicated herself and became the chief matron of the largest hospital in the world, not just in the United States, but in the world. It was called Chimborazo Hospital, and she ran that hospital for 3 years. She wrote a wonderful book filled with pathos, filled with some amusing anecdotes. It's called A Southern Lady's Story. It's worth putting on your shelf to get that volume and read about Phoebe Pember. Don't forget Michigan's great war politicians, Zachariah Chandler and Jacob Howard, both Detroiters, both very powerful figures in the federal government during the Civil War. Jacob Howard, you may or may not know, is one of the authors of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed to free the slaves. Both of these men are buried at Elmwood Cemetery in Detroit, and our war governor, Austin Blair, was so supportive of Lincoln. He was responsible for sending the masses of troops from the state of Michigan. Some 80, almost 90,000 Michigan men would serve the Union cause. Government in the United States changed significantly, and it changed forever as a result of the American Civil War. When the Civil War began, there was only one federal government agency that had any impact on us as individuals, just as ordinary citizens, and that was the post office. Lawsuits, almost everything government-wise was settled on or completed on a local level or a state level. But Washington was not involved. But during the Civil War, the federal government would declare martial law in areas. They suspended the writ of habeas corpus. More than 300 northern politicians, sympathizers with the South, were actually incarcerated in federal prisons and jails. Property was confiscated. Standardization of railroad tracks occurred, which was extremely necessary. Standardization of currency. A host of new taxes were established during the war, as was an Internal Revenue Bureau, which we all love so much. Conscription. I was telling my youngest son the other day, he's 18 years old, he was asking about conscription, and I said, the way they're doing it in this little photograph down here is not a lot different than they did when I was in the Vietnam era. I didn't go to Vietnam, but I did serve in the military. I did not get drafted. But that's conscription in 1862-63 is not a great deal different than what they did in the Civil War. And of course, the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the rebelling states. The U.S. government created the first welfare agency, the Freedmen's Bureau, and they passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Our government burgeoned and has continued to burgeon over the last 150 years, but it began with the Civil War. There is no doubt how important the Emancipation Proclamation was, not just because it freed African Americans. In 1862, the South had won a series of battles. It looked as though the South might actually achieve their independence. And the United States would break into these two countries, the United States and the Confederate States. What could Abraham Lincoln do to keep Europeans, primarily the English and the French, from recognizing the Confederacy, for providing them with not only monetary aid, but perhaps even military aid? He added a moral compunction to the war. No longer did the war just be a war to preserve the Union. It became a war to free people, to free the slave. And because of that, this Emancipation document was signed, went into law on January the 1st of 1863. England and France immediately withdrew their support of the Confederacy. European nations that had been somewhat sympathetic said, no, this is now a moral issue. It's not just rebelling southern states. There's a moral aspect to this. And in the United States, throughout our country, there were artists that rendered all types of artistic art forms to really praise the Emancipation Proclamation, and lithographers and printers came out with documents that they would sell in their stores. It is a document that certainly has impacted not only America, but really the world. Presidents from the Civil War, if you look at Abraham Lincoln, we know he was our commander-in-chief during the war, but all the other men up here, Andrew Johnson, Grant Hayes, so forth, they all served in the Civil War. Andrew Johnson was a brigadier general down in the state of Tennessee. Grant was our primary commander during the war, commander-in-chief. Rutherford B. Hayes from Ohio, Garfield and McKinley from Ohio, Chester Arthur from New York, and Benjamin Harrison from the great state of Indiana. It's also interesting when you look at these figures that in the history of our country, we've had 4 presidents assassinated, the most recent, John Kennedy. But 3 of these men were assassinated. Abraham Lincoln is the first president to be assassinated, and then James Garfield, and then in 1900, William McKinley. Technology. You have to look at technology when you think of any war. But in our war, in our Civil War, start in the bottom left corner. How did news of Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address on March 4th of 1861, how did that get to California? The Pony Express. And they set a record in getting it to California, incidentally. But within a few short months, the Pony Express was extinct. It was replaced by the telegraph key. In all wars, there are all types of military weapons that are created. In this illustration, Abraham Lincoln is firing a Spencer rifle. It was a repeating rifle that fired 7 shots. Old Southerners who were on the end of the receiving end of those bullets often said a Union soldier could load that gun up on a Sunday and he could shoot it all week without reloading. Well, if he fired 1 shot a day, that was correct. But Lincoln liked this weapon. He thought this was a terrific weapon, and here in Michigan, a number of our units, our regiments, actually used Spencer rifles and later Spencer repeating carbines. The most famous units here that would use it were part of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade under a young general named George Custer. The sewing machine. The sewing machine made incredible changes in the American Civil War. You don't think of a sewing machine as having much impact. However, the sewing machine allowed women to sew 10 times faster to make those wool uniforms for Billy Yank and Johnny Reb that would keep them warm through the inclement weather that we would have in the fall and through the winter and into the early spring. I would submit that those ladies that worked at those sewing machines saved thousands and thousands of lives. Photography showed up at this time. Actually, photography was brought into the United States in the year 1840. But it was the American Civil War that caused it to burgeon. Every soldier wanted a photograph taken. And indeed, there were millions and millions of photographs taken as ambrotypes, which are on glass, as tintypes, obviously on tin, sometimes called ferrotypes, paper types of photographs, albuminized prints, little carte de visites, visiting cards with a soldier's photo on them. Millions of them were taken, and you still see them today in antique shops. You see them at collector shows. You see them at antique shows. That's a tie that binds us to these people from 150 years ago. And of course, there were many factories and so forth that were created during the time. I mentioned the telegraph a second ago. The United States military created a signal service, a signal corps for the telegraph. This is their insignia down at the bottom. A captain's straps at the top with the insignia on them. The soldiers climbing up the telephone poles, and the one in the lower right is actually a photograph. The telegraph changes the whole focus of communication, much like our iPhones today. I don't know how to use an iPhone yet, but my kids do. But communication becomes so important.